Imagine you're sitting around a fire. It's 100,000 years ago. You're cold, you're hungry, and there's something massive and furry lurking just outside the light. You want to warn your buddy across the fire, so you do what any modern human would do. You open your mouth, and absolutely nothing comes out. Because here's the thing nobody talks about. There was a time, a real, documented, scientifically verified time, when human beings could not speak. Not a single word. Not a grunt that meant anything. Just biological silence. And the question of how we went from that, from a creature staring blankly at a mammoth, to a species that invented podcast drama, political debates, and the phrase, "I'm fine," when we are clearly not fine. That question is one of the most insane mysteries in all of science. And we're going to go through it today. Let's start with the problem. Unlike bones, unlike tools, unlike cave paintings, language leaves no physical trace. You cannot dig up a fossil and find a sentence. You cannot carbon date a conversation. Language is made of air, and air does not preserve well over geological timescales. So scientists studying the origin of speech are essentially forensic linguists, piecing together an ancient puzzle from whatever fragments they can find. Skull shapes, hyoid bones, genetic mutations, cave art, and a lot of educated guessing. And the educated guesses are extraordinary. The first thing we need to get straight is, what exactly is language? Because before humans had real language, we almost certainly had something. Animals communicate. That's not up for debate. Bees do a little waggle dance to tell their friends where the good flowers are. Dolphins have signature whistles that function like names. Chimpanzees in the wild have a system of calls and gestures that conveys basic information. So the question isn't, when did living things start communicating? The question is, when did communication become language? When did it cross that line from signal to symbol? Because there's a massive fundamental difference between the two. A signal is direct. It means one thing. A dog growls because it's threatened. The growl is the threat. But a symbol is abstract. The word danger is just an arrangement of sounds that, by collective agreement, represents the concept of danger. It doesn't sound like danger. It doesn't look like danger. We all just agreed, at some point, that those particular vibrations in the air would mean that specific thing. That's insane when you think about it. Every word you've ever spoken is a social hallucination that billions of people happen to share. And making that leap from signal to symbol, from direct response to abstract meaning, that was the cognitive revolution that changed everything. Now, scientists don't agree on exactly when it happened, and honestly, that's part of what makes this so fascinating. There are two major camps, and they've been fighting about this for decades. Camp 1 says language evolved gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, slowly complexifying from simple calls into full grammar. This is the continuity hypothesis, and its supporters point to our evolutionary relatives, chimps, bonobos, gorillas, who already show rudimentary symbolic thinking. They can learn signs. They can combine symbols in new ways. They seem to understand that things have names. So maybe language is just the end point of a very long road that started way, way back. Camp 2 says something very different. They say there was a moment, a specific leap, probably somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, when something clicked in the human brain. Some mutation or some threshold of brain complexity that suddenly unlocked full recursive syntax, the ability to embed ideas inside other ideas. The man who I think knows the woman who lost the dog. That kind of complexity. Sentences inside sentences inside sentences. And before that moment, there was nothing even close. This is the discontinuity hypothesis, and if it's right, then language didn't grow. It erupted. The truth is probably somewhere in between, and it involves several different pieces coming together at different times. Let's talk about the body first, because language isn't just a mental thing, it's a physical one. To produce the range of sounds that make up human speech, you need a very specific anatomy. And for most of evolutionary history, our ancestors didn't have it. The key structure is the larynx, your voice box, and more specifically, its position in the throat. In most mammals, including our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, the larynx sits high in the throat. This is actually useful for them. It means they can breathe and swallow at the same time, which reduces the risk of choking. Practical, efficient, but it severely limits the range of sounds they can produce. In humans, the larynx is positioned much lower. This creates a larger resonating chamber, the pharynx, which is what allows us to produce the full range of vowels and consonants that make speech possible. The trade-off, we can choke. We are literally the only mammals that regularly die from inhaling food. Every year, thousands of people choke to death on things like poorly chewed steak or ambitious sandwiches. Evolution looked at the ability to speak and said, yes, worth the risk of dying to a rogue piece of bread. The descent of the larynx likely happened gradually over millions of years, and different species of the genus Homo had it to varying degrees. But here's the frustrating part. Larynx position isn't preserved in fossils. Soft tissue doesn't fossilize, so we're back to inference and probability. What does preserve is is bone. And there's one bone in particular that gives us clues: the hyoid. The hyoid is a small, U-shaped bone in your throat that anchors the muscles used in speaking and swallowing. It's the only bone in the human body that doesn't articulate with any other bone. It just floats in there, held by muscles and tendons. And because of its relationship to the muscles involved in speech, its shape can tell us something about an ancient hominid's vocal capacity. In 1989, a complete hyoid bone was found at a Neanderthal burial site at Kebera Cave in Israel. It was 60,000 years old, and when scientists analyzed its shape, they found something remarkable. It was nearly identical to a modern human hyoid. This was a huge deal. It suggested that Neanderthals, our thick-browed, stocky cousins who lived across Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, might have had the physical capacity for speech. And then the genetics people showed up, and things got really interesting. In 2002, scientists identified a gene called FOXP2, and it immediately became famous, probably too famous because the press started calling it the language gene, which is a massive oversimplification that made every actual geneticist quietly scream. But the reason it got that nickname is real. Humans with damaged copies of FOXP2 have severe difficulties with speech and language. They struggle to coordinate the fine motor movements needed for speaking. They have trouble with grammar. It's a genuinely debilitating condition. What made the discovery explosive was this: the human version of FOXP2 is different from the version found in every other mammal, including chimpanzees. Mice have FOXP2. Songbirds have FOXP2. Even crocodiles have FOXP2. But the human variant has two specific mutations that don't appear anywhere else in the animal kingdom. Mutations that appear to have undergone strong positive selection, meaning evolution really wanted us to have them. And then researchers tested Neanderthal DNA. They had Neanderthal DNA. They had extracted it from ancient bones. And when they looked at the FOXP2 gene, the Neanderthals had the same human mutations, the same ones, which means Neanderthals and modern humans shared this genetic adaptation for speech. And since both lineages diverged from a common ancestor at least 400,000 years ago, FOXP2 had to have been present in that common ancestor too. Or it evolved independently in both lineages, which would be such a jaw-dropping coincidence that most scientists refuse to believe it. So here's where that leaves us. By at least 400,000 years ago, possibly earlier, our ancestors had the genetics for the physical coordination needed for speech. By 60,000 years ago, at the latest, Neanderthals had the physical throat anatomy that could support complex vocalization. And sometime before that, somewhere in the lineage leading to modern humans, the brain had wired itself for symbolic language. But none of this tells us what those first words actually were. And this is where things get wonderfully weird, because there are several competing theories, and some of them are absolutely hilarious. The oldest and most dismissive theory is called the bow wow theory. The idea is simple. The first words were imitations of sounds in the environment. You see a dog, you say something like the noise it makes. You hear thunder, you name it after the sound. This is called onomatopoeia, and it's real. Words like crash and buzz and hiss are clearly rooted in the sounds they describe, but it can only account for a tiny fraction of vocabulary. You can't really onomatopoeia your way to words like justice or therefore or bureaucracy. At some point, you need arbitrary symbols. Then there's the poo-poo theory. Yes, that's its real academic name. This one suggests that language began from involuntary emotional sounds. The ouch when you stub your toe, the sigh of relief, the laugh. And while these vocalizations are clearly ancient and deeply embedded in our biology, they're also largely instinctive and uncontrolled, which makes it hard to see how they evolved into deliberate, structured language. There's the yo-he-ho theory, which proposes that rhythmic grunts made during coordinated physical labor, hauling a heavy log, rowing together, pulling a rope, gave rise to the rhythmic patterns underlying speech. Think of sea shanties as a living fossil of proto-language. There's actually something to this. Music and language share enormous overlaps in the brain, and many researchers believe they co-evolve, which would mean that singing came before speaking. And then there's the ta-ta theory, which is genuinely delightful. It suggests that language began as vocal imitations of gesture, that early humans were gesturing with their hands and their mouths started mimicking the movements, gradually turning physical signals into vocal ones. The idea has been mostly abandoned, but it lives on as a reminder that the history of linguistics includes people naming theories after nonsense syllables. The gesture hypothesis, though, the broader idea that language may have roots in hand and body gesture, is taken much more seriously. And here's why. Look at the brain. The area of the brain responsible for language in modern humans, Broca's area, is closely linked to areas that control fine motor movements of the hands. In non-human primates, this same region seems to be involved in processing manual gestures and facial expressions. The connection is not accidental. Moreover, many features of language make more sense. Pointing is arguably the most fundamental linguistic act. It means attend to that thing over there. And pointing with a finger appears to be unique to humans and possibly great apes in captivity. Chimps in the wild almost never point. Infants learn to point before they learn to speak. There's a powerful argument that language began with the hands and the voice caught up later, which brings us to perhaps the most important and underappreciated part of the whole story, the social brain. You can have the right anatomy, you can have the FOXP2 gene, you can have vocal cords and a low larynx and Broca's area all wired up and ready to go. But none of it matters unless you have the cognitive infrastructure for what language actually requires. Theory of mind. Theory of mind is the ability to understand that other beings have thoughts, beliefs, and intentions that are different from your own. It's the ability to model another mind. And language, real language, not just signaling, requires it absolutely. Because when I say a word to you, I'm not just making a noise. I'm making a noise with the intention that you will recognize my intention to communicate a specific meaning. That's a sentence I just said, and it's mind-bending when you unpack it. Language is built on a kind of social telepathy. I'm trusting that you can read my mind, and you're trusting that I mean to be understood. This is actually something non-human animals appear to largely lack, or at least to have in much more limited form. When a chimp communicates, it's typically requesting something or responding to a situation. It's not trying to share information for the sake of sharing information. The collaborative, cooperative sharing of knowledge, telling someone about something that happened yesterday, describing a place you visited, speculating about the future, that appears to require a level of social cognition that is distinctly, radically human. And interestingly, the development of this social cognition seems to track closely with something else that was happening in our evolutionary history, a massive increase in group size. About 500,000 years ago, our ancestors were living in small bands. By 100,000 years ago, groups were getting larger and more complex. Managing relationships in larger groups requires keeping track of more people, their alliances, their histories, their trustworthiness. Some researchers, most famously the evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar, have argued that language evolved precisely as a solution to this social complexity problem. He called it social grooming by another means. Chimpanzees maintain social bonds by literally picking insects off each other, which is sweet, but doesn't scale well when you have 150 people in your tribe. Language lets you bond with multiple people simultaneously. Gossip essentially was the killer app that drove the evolution of language. And once language existed, the feedback loops became extraordinary. Language allowed better coordination, which allowed bigger and more complex societies. Bigger and more complex societies created more information that needed to be transmitted, which put pressure on language to become more precise and more powerful. More precise language allowed the transmission of knowledge across generations, not just the immediate showing of how to nap a flint, but the verbal instruction, the explanation, the story that embeds the knowledge in a narrative that can travel across time. And once knowledge could accumulate across generations rather than being reinvented every time, cultural evolution took off at a pace that biological evolution couldn't match. The moment language crystallized, the game changed permanently. Suddenly, humans could cooperate with strangers, could plan months in advance, could lie, which is honestly an underrated cognitive achievement, could create myths and stories and gods and social rules that bound large groups of unrelated individuals together into functioning societies. Everything that came after, agriculture, cities, writing, science, the internet, this YouTube video, traces back to that first moment when a human being looked at another human being and said something that both of them understood to mean the same thing. We don't know exactly when that happened. We don't know exactly where, though Africa is the near universal consensus. We don't know what the first word was, and we almost certainly never will. But we can say with reasonable confidence that by 70,000 years ago, when modern humans suddenly began doing things that look dramatically different from anything before, creating art and jewelry and complex tools and trading across vast distances, language was there, fully functioning, turning individual minds into a shared project. The behavioral explosion that archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution is, in many ways, just the visible fingerprint of language. The cave paintings at Chauvet, 36,000 years old, depicting animals with movement, with depth, with narrative. They are the work of minds that had stories. The Venus figurines scattered across Europe, the carved flutes made from vulture bone, the careful arrangement of red ochre and shells as personal decoration. All of these are the products of a species that had learned to take things that existed in the mind and make them exist in the world. That is what language does. It externalizes thought. It makes the invisible visible, the temporary permanent, the individual collective. And here's the thing that should genuinely blow your mind. Every language on Earth today, all 7,000 of them, from Mandarin to Swahili to Basque to the click languages of the Kalahari, every single one of them, despite their extraordinary surface differences, shares deep structural properties that linguists believe are hardwired into the human brain. Noam Chomsky called it universal grammar, the idea that all human languages are fundamentally the same language wearing different clothes because they all emerge from the same underlying cognitive architecture. Babies across all cultures, in all languages, in all circumstances, acquire language the same way, at the same pace, with the same stages. A baby in Tokyo and a baby in Lagos and a baby in Sao Paulo will all babble, then produce single words, then two-word combinations, then full sentences on roughly the same timeline without anyone explicitly teaching them the rules of grammar. The capacity is in there. It was installed by evolution, and that capacity, that extraordinary, world-altering, species-defining capacity, came from a long series of accidents and adaptations and selection pressures acting on bodies and brains over millions of years. A larynx that dropped, a gene that mutated, a brain that wired itself for social complexity, a species that needed to keep track of who owed what to whom around increasingly complicated campfires. All of that so that one day, somewhere in Africa, two human beings could look at each other in the dark and one of them could say, "Hey, watch out, something is out there," and the other one could understand. That's the origin of language. That's where everything started. Not with poetry, not with philosophy, not with love songs. Though those came quickly enough, with two people sharing a piece of information that mattered, two minds touching across the dark, which is still, when you think about it, what language is every single time you use it. You're a hunter-gatherer 13,000 years ago. No supermarkets, no refrigerators, no Uber Eats. You live in a cave in what will one day become Israel, surrounded by people you actually like, which, let's be honest, is rarer than we think even today. You've been walking all day. Your feet hurt. You have no concept of shoes that cost more than $100, which is genuinely the only thing about your situation that could be called an improvement over modern life. And one day, someone in your group finds some grain that's been sitting in a whetstone mortar for a little too long. It smells weird. It looks bubbly. Something has clearly happened to it. Something biological. Something mysterious. And for reasons that defy all logic and every survival instinct a sensible primate should have developed, someone decides to drink it anyway. That person? Possibly the most important human being who ever lived. Because that accident, or that single moment of extraordinary, reckless, magnificent curiosity, may have set humanity on a path that changed everything. Not just parties. Not just wine ants at Christmas dinner who start talking about their feelings after the second glass. Everything. Civilization, agriculture, religion, writing, the entire architecture of human social life as we know it. So, when exactly did ancient humans first drink alcohol? And more importantly, why did we even start? Buckle up. Because the answer goes much, much further back than you think. And it starts not with humans at all. It starts with monkeys. Let's begin with a question that sounds ridiculous on the surface, but is actually the most important one we can ask. Were humans biologically designed to handle alcohol in the first place? Most animals, when they consume ethanol in any meaningful quantity, basically fall over and die. Or, at minimum, have a deeply unpleasant time. Their bodies can't process it efficiently. Their livers stage an immediate protest. The whole experience is, for most creatures on Earth, something between deeply unpleasant and fatal. But humans, and our close primate relatives, are different. We have a specific enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase 4, or ADH4, which lets us break down ethanol with surprising efficiency. Our bodies are, to a remarkable degree, built to handle this molecule. And here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. That enzyme didn't appear when humans invented wine. It didn't appear when agriculture began. It appeared roughly 10 million years ago. 10 million years. That is before Homo sapiens existed. That is before Homo erectus existed. That's before basically anything we would recognize as a human being was walking around on this planet. That mutation emerged deep in the primate family tree, right around the period when our ancestors were transitioning from spending most of their lives in the trees to spending more time on the ground. Which means for 10 million years, long before we were consciously choosing to drink, our bodies were already preparing for the relationship. A biologist at UC Berkeley named Robert Dudley spent 25 years trying to figure out why. And the theory he developed has the greatest name in the history of science. He calls it the drunken monkey hypothesis. The idea is elegant in its simplicity. Our ancient primate ancestors ate fruit, enormous quantities of fruit. Fruit was a primary calorie source for millions of years. And fruit, when it gets ripe, truly, perfectly ripe, begins to ferment. Yeasts that live naturally in the environment land on the surface of the fruit, consume the sugars inside, and produce ethanol as a byproduct. The fruit starts to smell faintly of alcohol, which means that for millions of years, every time a primate found a piece of perfectly ripe fruit, it was also finding trace amounts of ethanol. And here's the key insight. The smell of ethanol wasn't a warning sign. It was a beacon. It meant this fruit is at maximum ripeness, maximum sweetness, maximum caloric value. It meant eat this now before it's gone. The ancestors who ignored that fermented smell missed out on easy calories and left them for someone else. The ones who followed the smell, who were drawn to it, who felt a pull toward it. Those ancestors got more food, survived longer, had more offspring, and passed that preference down the line. Over millions of years, through the completely impersonal logic of natural selection, a preference for the scent and taste of alcohol became baked into the primate nervous system. We were literally selected by evolution to enjoy the smell of booze. This is not a character flaw. This is not weakness. This is 10 million years of adaptation working exactly as designed. You literally cannot blame yourself. Now, the drunken monkey hypothesis isn't just theoretical. It's been tested. Researchers went to Panama and studied wild black-handed spider monkeys, collecting the fruit these animals actively chose to eat and testing it for alcohol content. The fruit these monkeys preferred regularly contained between 1 and 2% alcohol by volume, a natural result of fermentation happening inside the ripening fruit. And when scientists analyzed urine samples collected from the same free-ranging monkeys, they found secondary metabolites of ethanol. Proof that the animals were not just ingesting the alcohol, but actively metabolizing it. Even more striking, a parallel study of chimpanzees living in the Ivory Coast found that their typical daily fruit diet could expose them to the equivalent of 1 to 2 full human drinks worth of ethanol every single day, without making any choices about it, just by eating their normal food. So your ancient ancestor was technically getting a mild buzz in the forest 10 million years ago and had absolutely no idea. The desire, the biological pull, the preference. It was all set up long before a single human being ever intentionally fermented anything. The family relationship with alcohol is, it turns out, a very old one. All right, so we've established that primates have been accidentally consuming fermented fruit for millions of years and that our bodies evolved to enjoy and process it. But at some point, the story changes. At some point, a human, an actual cognitively modern human, decides not just to stumble upon fermented food accidentally, but to deliberately make it. This is a different and enormous leap. It requires observation, it requires memory, it requires the ability to notice that something happened to this grain last time it got wet, and to decide to reproduce that process intentionally. It requires, in other words, something that looks a lot like science. So when did that leap happen? The oldest confirmed evidence of deliberate human alcohol production sits inside a cave in Israel, Rakafet Cave, near modern-day Haifa. It was a burial site used by a people called the Natufians, a group of semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers who lived in the eastern Mediterranean region between roughly 15,000 and 11,500 years ago. These were smart, socially complex people. They buried their dead with flowers. They kept dogs as companions. The earliest evidence of dog domestication is associated with Natufian culture. They were not primitive in any meaningful sense of the word. And inside their burial cave, among the human remains, researchers found large stone mortars, carved stone bowls, that still held residue after 13,000 years. When a team led by Stanford archaeologist Li Liu analyzed that residue using microfossil and chemical analysis, looking at starch granules and microscopic plant particles called phytoliths, the picture that emerged was unambiguous. They had been making beer. Not wine, not some vague fermented liquid. Beer, made from wheat and barley, produced through a three-stage process. First malting the grain by germinating it in water, then mashing and heating it, then leaving it to ferment with wild airborne yeast. An intentional, multi-step, technically sophisticated brewing process. 13,000 years ago. Now here is the thing that should make your brain quietly short-circuit. This predates agriculture. The Natufians were not farmers. They did not grow crops. They gathered wild grain from the landscape around them, and instead of eating all of it, they used some to make beer. Deliberately, ritually, for their dead. And this single fact has fueled one of the most genuinely fascinating debates in all of archaeology. Did humans first settle down and begin farming because they wanted reliable grain for bread? Or because they wanted reliable grain for beer? The beer before bread hypothesis, championed most famously by archaeologist Brian Hayden, argues that the desire to produce fermented grain beverages reliably and consistently may have been one of the key motivations, possibly the primary motivation, behind the agricultural revolution. Think about it from first principles. Why would a nomadic hunter-gatherer living a reasonably successful life by moving with the seasons and following food sources suddenly decide to stay in one place, break up the ground, plant seeds, and wait months for them to grow? What would make that trade-off worthwhile? Beer. A guaranteed supply of beer. And beyond beer, the ability to produce a reliable surplus of a calorie-dense, mildly intoxicating beverage that also happened to be safer than drinking local water, that could be shared at communal feasts, that could be used to honor the dead, that could mark the transition between seasons and the sacred events of human life. This is deeply controversial. Many archaeologists argue that bread and nutrition came first, and that beer was an extension of grain processing already developed for food. But the Natufian discovery has given the beer hypothesis powerful new evidence. Because here were people, 13,000 years ago, before agriculture existed anywhere on Earth, who were already brewing. The desire to make alcohol demonstrably predates organized farming. The timeline is settled. The argument is alive. Let that sit for a moment. The oldest intentional alcohol production on Earth was not made by farmers, not by city builders, not by people we usually associate with civilization. It was made by nomadic cave dwellers in the context of burying and honoring their dead. From the very beginning, alcohol was never just about having a good time. It was sacred. Let's keep moving forward through time, because after the Natufians, the archaeological record starts filling up quickly and from multiple directions simultaneously. Jump roughly 4,000 years forward to around 7,000 BCE, which sounds like a long time, but is actually relatively recent in the context of everything we've discussed so far. And we arrive in Jiahu, a Neolithic village in China's Yellow River Valley. Researchers led by molecular archaeologist Patrick McGovern of the University of Pennsylvania analyzed residues inside early pottery jars excavated from the site. What they found was remarkable: a mixed fermented beverage combining rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit, possibly also grape. 9,000 years old, what you might reasonably describe as an ancient cocktail. Around the same period, in what is now the country of Georgia, in a small village called Gadakrili Gora, archaeologists found evidence of wine production going back approximately 8,000 years. The inside of large clay storage jars still bore the chemical signatures of grape fermentation. This is currently the oldest confirmed wine in the world. Georgia still makes wine the traditional way, in large clay vessels called kvaevri that are buried in the earth. And Georgians will tell you with complete justification that they invented wine. There is truly no arguing with them, and there is no reason to try. Meanwhile, also in China, at a site called Chaotu, dating to around 9,000 years ago, researchers found pottery vessels containing beer brewed from rice and a grain called Job's tears, which still grows in East Asia today. More significantly, at Chaotu, they also discovered the earliest known evidence of mold-based fermentation starters, a technique using specific fungi to break down the complex starches in grain before fermentation, which predates any written record of the method by thousands of years. This technique is the direct ancestor of the processes used today to make sake, baijiu, Korean makioli, and dozens of other East Asian fermented drinks. 9,000 years of continuous tradition, running unbroken from a Neolithic pottery vessel to a glass on a table somewhere in Tokyo tonight. What this geographic spread tells us is extraordinary. These cultures, China, Georgia, the Eastern Mediterranean, were not in contact with each other. They were not trading information or recipes. They each discovered fermentation entirely independently, and they all did it within roughly the same window of human prehistory, which means fermentation is not a lucky accident that happened once and spread. It is something that humans, when given grain or fruit or honey and a sufficient period of time and curiosity, will discover on their own. Every time. We are, as a species, fundamentally and incurably fermentation curious. Now, let's talk about the civilization that turned alcohol from a discovery into a full bureaucratic system. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq. The Sumerians, then the Akkadians, then the Babylonians. The place where writing was invented, and where, perhaps not coincidentally, some of the very first things written down were records about beer. Archaeological evidence from Göbekli Tepe in the Zagros Mountains of western Iran places beer production in the greater Mesopotamian region as early as 3500 BCE. Chemists found calcium oxalate, a residue produced during beer fermentation, crystallized and preserved inside ancient clay vessels. The same site also yielded the earliest chemically confirmed wine residue in the Near East. But Mesopotamia didn't just drink. Mesopotamia organized drinking into a social and economic institution. This is perhaps the most Mesopotamian thing imaginable, and it is wonderful. Sumerian workers received daily rations of beer as a fundamental part of their compensation. This wasn't casual generosity. It was the system. If you were a laborer building a temple, a scribe copying tablets, a farmer clearing irrigation channels, you received beer. Detailed administrative tablets survive that record these distributions with the same meticulous precision a modern accountant brings to a payroll system. Workers of average rank might receive around 2 liters of beer per day. Senior officials and higher-ranking individuals received more. Even individuals who had died were provisioned with beer for the journey into the afterlife, because apparently the Sumerians saw no reason why death should interrupt a reasonable daily ration. Beer was currency. Beer was wages. Beer was religion. Beer was medicine. Beer was the social fabric itself. The Sumerians loved beer so deeply, so sincerely, so reverently, that they created an entire goddess to embody it. Her name was Ninkasi, which translates magnificently as the lady who fills the mouth. She was the daughter of Enki, the creator god, and Ninti, queen of the sacred lake. She was a major figure in the Sumerian pantheon, and her domain was not just brewing, it was the entire civilizing power that fermented grain represented. Around 1800 BCE, an anonymous Sumerian poet composed a hymn in her honor. The hymn to Ninkasi is one of the most extraordinary documents to survive from the ancient world. It is a religious poem. It is a declaration of love for a goddess, and depending on which scholars you consult, it is also, embedded within its verses, something remarkably close to a step-by-step brewing recipe. Written on 2 clay tablets, it describes the malting of grain, the baking of it into a bread called bapir, the soaking, the fermenting, the filtering of the final liquid through a woven basket. The process is described in enough detail that in 1989, a modern American brewer named Fritz Maytag, founder of Anchor Brewing Company in San Francisco, actually attempted to recreate it. The result was served at the annual meeting of the American Association of Microbrewers. Attendees drank it from clay jugs through long straws, as the Sumerians had. The alcohol content was around 3.5%. The taste was reportedly reminiscent of champagne mixed with dates. 3,800 years after that hymn was written, it still worked. That is either a testament to the precision of ancient Sumerian brewing knowledge or to the fundamental robustness of fermentation as a process. Probably both. The Babylonians, who inherited and expanded much of Sumerian culture, took this further still. They documented at least 70 varieties of beer. 70. Light beer, dark beer, filtered beer, beer mixed with honey, spiced varieties, regional styles. They had an entire taxonomy of fermented beverages at a period when most of the world's population was still organizing itself into the first agricultural settlements. And then, and this is the detail that genuinely makes me laugh every time, the Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest surviving written law codes in human history, dating to approximately 1754 BCE, includes specific legislation about beer, about the minimum quality standards taverns must maintain, about the proper pricing of different grades of beer, about what happens to a tavern owner caught watering down their product. If you watered down your beer in ancient Babylon, the punishment was being thrown into the river. Humanity's first great written legal code included consumer protection law for alcohol quality. We have, as a species, always known what matters. Egypt deserves its own chapter in this story, because the Egyptians were doing something slightly different and, in many ways, more interesting. Ancient Egyptians consumed both beer and wine, and both were completely central to their religious and daily lives. The workers who built the pyramids, not slaves, as decades of Egyptological research has established, received regular rations of beer and bread as the foundational elements of their diet and their pay. Egyptian beer, made primarily from emmer wheat, was thick, nutritious, and low in alcohol by modern standards. In a climate where Nile water could carry dangerous pathogens, a fermented beverage with its natural antimicrobial properties was often genuinely safer to drink. Beer was, in a very real sense, public health infrastructure. Wine, however, was prestige. Wine was for the elite, for high ceremony, for offerings placed before the gods, and for the burial chambers of pharaohs. When archaeologists excavate royal Egyptian tombs, they find wine jars, sealed and labeled. Labeled not just with the vintage year, but with the vineyard of origin, and, in some cases, the name of the chief vintner responsible. The world's oldest wine labels, sitting in tombs sealed for 3,000 years. The Egyptians attributed the gift of beer to Osiris, god of the dead, of resurrection, of the eternal cycle of life and renewal. Not as a curse, as a civilization-building gift. Beer, in Egyptian theology, was one of the things that made humans human. Alongside bread and medicine, it was a pillar of civilized life. And here is the thread that runs through all of this, from the Natufians to Sumer to Egypt to ancient China. In virtually every culture, in every archaeological context where we find the earliest evidence of intentional alcohol production, it is tied to ritual, to the sacred, to death and burial, to offerings and prayers, to the transition between the world of the living and whatever comes after. The Natufians brewed beer in a burial cave to honor their dead. The Sumerians dedicated an entire goddess to brewing and distributed beer as a fundamental part of religious life. The Egyptians offered wine to Osiris at the border between this world and the next. Ancient Chinese burial sites from 9,000 years ago contain painted pottery vessels that held beer made for the deceased. The earliest alcohol production we can identify across the entire span of human archaeology, on every continent where it has been studied, is fundamentally bound up with the spiritual, the communal, and the sacred. This is not a coincidence. There is something about altered states of consciousness, about the loosening of ordinary perception that a fermented beverage provides, that humans have consistently understood to be meaningful, to be a doorway, to represent a moment of stepping outside the ordinary bounds of individual experience and touching something larger. Whether you interpret that spiritually or neurologically or purely socially, the pattern is real. Humans didn't invent alcohol as a way to forget their problems after a long day of prehistoric agriculture. They invented it, or rather discovered and cultivated it, as a way of marking the moments that matter most. Birth, death, harvest, prayer, the turning of seasons, the binding of communities together. So, when did ancient humans first drink alcohol? The complete answer spans an almost incomprehensible range of time. The biological foundation, the genetic machinery that lets us metabolize ethanol, the enzymatic preference that makes us seek it out, was laid 10 million years ago in the primate ancestors we share with every living ape and monkey on Earth. Our bodies were shaped by millions of years of finding fermented fruit in the forest before a single human being ever consciously decided to make a drink. The first intentional production, 13,000 years ago, confirmed in a cave in Israel by hunter-gatherers who brewed beer as an act of devotion to their dead. The spread across civilizations, the following several thousand years independently and simultaneously, in China, Georgia, Iran, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and beyond. From there, the trajectory is relatively well documented. Beer rations in Sumer, wine in Egypt's royal tombs, hymns to brewing goddesses, law codes, protecting the quality of tavern pours, and an unbroken chain of fermentation knowledge that connects a Neolithic pottery vessel to every bar, winery, brewery, and kitchen in the world today. The next time someone passes you a drink, take a moment to appreciate the full weight of what you're holding. That glass is connected through an uninterrupted chain of human curiosity and ritual and survival and community, all the way back to a hunter-gatherer standing in a cave 13,000 years ago, tasting something strange and uncertain and finding it, against all reasonable expectations, good. And behind that, another 10 million years of monkeys in the forest, following the smell of something sweet and slightly wrong and deciding every time to go toward it. Humanity didn't stumble into alcohol by accident. We grew toward it, the way a plant grows toward light. Okay, I'm off now. I'm gonna get completely drunk. In the meantime, click on the next video. Bro, please, just click. See you soon. You don't remember being born. You don't remember your first word, your first step, or the first time someone held you and you looked up at their face. You don't remember learning what a dog was, or the first time you tasted something sweet, or the moment you figured out that your hands belonged to you. And here's the thing. Those moments happened. They were real. You were there. You were conscious. You were feeling things, experiencing things, processing an entirely new world at an astonishing rate. And then it just vanished. Everything before roughly age 3 is gone for most people. Some people have a fragment or two from age 4, a birthday, a car ride, a smell. But the first years of your life, the most dramatic period of growth and learning your brain will ever undergo, exist in almost complete silence. No memories, nothing. So where did they go? Because this isn't like forgetting where you put your keys. This is a systematic, near total erasure of the first chapter of your existence. And for a long time, nobody could satisfactorily explain why it happens. Now we have some answers, and they are genuinely fascinating. Let's start with the obvious question. Were you even conscious back then? Were you actually experiencing anything worth remembering? Yes. Unambiguously yes. Infants are not passive receivers of sensory input. They are active, curious, emotionally responsive beings from extremely early on. Newborns can recognize their mother's voice within hours of birth. They heard it in the womb, and the memory of that sound is already encoded before they've even seen daylight. Within days, they show preferences. They respond differently to faces they've seen versus faces they haven't. They cry differently for hunger versus pain versus loneliness. There is someone home. A real experiencing consciousness is present from the very beginning. And yet, none of it sticks. Not in a form you can access now. The first major clue to understanding why comes from looking at what memory actually is and how it gets built. Memory isn't a recording. This is probably the most important thing to understand about how the brain stores experience, and it's wildly counterintuitive. When something happens to you, your brain doesn't hit a record button and file away a video clip. What it does is far messier and far more interesting. Different aspects of an experience get processed by different brain regions simultaneously. The emotional content goes one place. The sensory details go somewhere else. The sequence of events, the narrative of what happened, goes somewhere else entirely. For you to have a retrievable autobiographical memory, a memory of the I was there and this happened to me variety, all of those pieces need to be linked together and consolidated into a stable, accessible package. That process requires a specific brain structure called the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the brain's memory indexer. It's the region that binds the scattered pieces of an experience into a coherent whole and files it somewhere you can later retrieve. Without hippocampal involvement, you might process an experience, you might even be affected by it emotionally, but you won't have a conscious narrative memory of it that you can deliberately recall. And here's the key: the hippocampus in human infants is dramatically underdeveloped, not slightly behind, not almost there. Dramatically, functionally incomplete in the first years of life. The neurons are there, but the connections between them, the dense, complex network of links that allows efficient memory encoding and retrieval, hasn't formed yet. The hippocampus undergoes significant development through the first 2 to 3 years of life, and in some regions continues developing well into adolescence. A baby experiencing something beautiful or frightening or joyful is like trying to record a video on a camera that doesn't have a memory card yet. The lens is working, the processor is running, but there's nowhere for the footage to go, so the memories don't form in the first place. Not in the retrievable, narrative sense, not the kind you can pull up 30 years later and play back. That's the first part of the answer. But it's not the whole answer, because it still doesn't explain why most people can't access memories from age 2 or 3, even though the hippocampus is considerably more developed by then than it was at birth. This is where it gets even more interesting. There's a second factor, and it has to do with something called neurogenesis. Your brain grows new neurons throughout your life. This was considered controversial for a long time. The old assumption was that you were born with all the neurons you'd ever have, and that was it. That turned out to be wrong. New neurons are generated continuously, particularly in the hippocampus. Now here's the twist. In early childhood, the rate of neurogenesis in the hippocampus is extraordinarily high, far higher than at any later point in life. The infant brain is generating new hippocampal neurons at a rate that simply doesn't happen in adults, and all of those new neurons need to be integrated into the existing network. They need to find their place, form connections, wire themselves into the system. That integration process is disruptive. It destabilizes existing connections. It essentially rewires the filing system. Think of it like this. Imagine you have a library, not a big organized library, a young chaotic one that's adding hundreds of new shelves every single day. Books are being added faster than they can be properly cataloged. The organization system keeps changing as new sections are built. Old books don't necessarily stay where you put them because the shelves themselves keep moving. That's your hippocampus in the first few years of life. The very thing that makes the infant brain so extraordinarily good at learning, that explosive growth, that relentless generation of new neurons, is simultaneously the thing that makes it almost impossible to form stable long-term memories. Rapid neurogenesis trades away memory consolidation in exchange for learning capacity. The infant brain is optimized for absorbing new information at maximum speed, not for filing it away in a form that will be accessible decades later. You were learning faster than any adult ever could, and the cost of that speed was forgetting everything. But there's a third factor, and this one is the strangest one of all: language. This sounds simple at first. Of course, babies can't form verbal memories, they don't have words yet. But it goes deeper than that, because the relationship between language and memory is more intimate than most people realize. Autobiographical memory, the "I remember when I was 5 and this happened" kind of memory, is deeply structurally connected to language. Not just because you need words to describe memories to other people, but because the internal experience of having a memory, of replaying it in your mind, of knowing that it happened to you and not someone else, that experience is mediated by language in ways that are hard to fully separate. When you remember something, you are, in part, narrating it to yourself. You're constructing a story, a sequence, a sense of self moving through time. And that narrative capacity, that ability to construct a story with yourself as the protagonist, emerges alongside language. Infants have a sense of self. Research has demonstrated that, but it's a present tense self. And "I am experiencing this right now" self. The extension of that self backward through time into a retrievable personal history, the autobiographical self, requires language as scaffolding. Without language, there's no story. Without a story, there's no narrator. And without a narrator, there's no one to be the subject of the memory. You can't remember "I was there" if you don't yet have a stable, language-mediated concept of "I." Studies across cultures support this. Children who develop language later also tend to have later onset of autobiographical memory. Bilingual children often have the clearest early memories in the language they were using at the time, even if they rarely use that language as adults. People who learned sign language as their first language show the same infantile amnesia patterns as hearing children who learned spoken language, suggesting that it's not spoken language specifically, but language as a cognitive system that matters. The words aren't just how you express the memory, they're part of how the memory is built in the first place. So now we have three overlapping explanations. Hippocampal immaturity, explosive neurogenesis disrupting consolidation, and the absence of language as a structuring scaffold for autobiographical experience. All three are real. All three are happening simultaneously, and together they create a window of near total amnesia that covers the most formative period of your life. But here's what makes this genuinely strange. The experiences you can't remember still shaped you. This is the part that people don't always fully sit with. Your infant years are gone from your conscious, retrievable memory, but they are absolutely not gone from you. Everything that happened in those years left traces, deep structural traces that influence who you are right now. The attachment patterns you formed with your caregivers in the first year of life, whether you learned that the world was safe and responsive or unpredictable and unreliable, are encoded not as memories, but as implicit expectations, ways of being, emotional reflexes that operate below conscious awareness. If you were consistently soothed when you cried, your nervous system learned, at a biological level, that distress is temporary and help is available. That expectation shapes how you respond to stress as an adult, how quickly you can calm yourself down, how much you trust that things will be okay. If you were inconsistently responded to or left to cry without comfort, your nervous system learned something different, not as a memory. As a setting, a default calibration of how safe the world is and how much you can rely on other people. None of this is accessible to you as a story you can tell. You can't remember the specific night you cried and no one came, or the specific morning you were held and felt completely safe. But those nights and mornings added up into something, a posture toward existence that you carry without knowing you're carrying it. This is what psychologists mean when they talk about implicit memory as opposed to explicit memory. Explicit memory is the kind you can consciously access and describe. Implicit memory is the kind that lives in your body, your emotional reactions, your automatic assumptions about how relationships work and whether you deserve to be cared for. Infantile amnesia erases your explicit memories. It leaves your implicit memories completely intact. You forgot the experiences, you kept the lessons. The problem is, you can't examine lessons you don't know you learned. You just act on them and wonder why you respond to certain situations the way you do. Now let's talk about the fake ones. Because here's where it gets uncomfortable. Some of the earliest memories you think you have are probably not real, not distorted, not exaggerated, actually fabricated, constructed by your brain from photographs, stories, and repeated tellings, and then filed as if they were genuine experiential memories. This is extremely well documented in memory research, and it's deeply unsettling the first time you really confront it. Here's how it happens. Your family has a photo of you at your second birthday party. You've seen that photo dozens of times growing up. Adults told you the story of that birthday, what happened, who was there, how you reacted to the cake. You heard that story enough times that your brain eventually built a mental representation of the event. And then at some point, your brain filed that mental representation in the same place as actual memories. Now it feels like a memory. It has the quality of a memory. You'd describe it as a memory if someone asked, but what you're actually accessing is a reconstruction built from external information, not a genuine trace of the original experience. Researchers have demonstrated that entirely false memories of events that never happened at all can be implanted in people through repeated suggestion and social reinforcement, and those false memories are experientially indistinguishable from real ones. If that's possible with fabricated events, the capacity for genuine experiences to be reconstructed and misfiled as direct memories is even more plausible. Think about the earliest memory you have right now, the one you'd reach for if someone asked. Where did it come from? Did you remember it always, unprompted? Or did someone tell you about it first? Is there a photo, a family story that gets a family told at reunions? The honest answer for most people is that they can't be sure. And that uncertainty is not comfortable, but it's important. Your memory of your own earliest life is, at least partly, a story other people told you about yourself that you eventually absorbed as your own, which raises a strange philosophical question. If the memory is vivid and emotionally real and functionally identical to a genuine memory in every way you can detect, does it matter that it might be a reconstruction? Some people say no. The memory serves the same function regardless of its origin. Others find it deeply disorienting, because the self you think you are is partly built on stories about your own past. And if those stories are borrowed rather than remembered, what does that mean for who you actually are? There's no clean answer to that. But it's worth sitting with. Let's come back to something more concrete. Why do some people have earlier memories than others? Because they do. The research consistently shows variation. Some people have what feel like genuine memories from as early as age 2. Others have nothing before 5 or 6. The average onset of reliable autobiographical memory is around 3 to 3.5 years. But the range is wide. Several factors seem to influence this. Culture is one of them. Studies comparing American children with children from cultures where parents less frequently engage in collaborative reminiscing, talking with children about shared past experiences, asking them questions about what they remember, narrating their own histories back to them, show that the cultural practice of memory talk significantly affects how early children begin forming retrievable autobiographical memories. In cultures where parents frequently say things like, "Remember when we went to the beach last summer? What did you see?" Where memory is actively rehearsed and socially reinforced, children develop earlier and more detailed autobiographical memories. The social practice of remembering together teaches children that their experiences are worth preserving and gives them the narrative scaffolding to do so. Memory, it turns out, is partly a social skill. And like all social skills, it develops faster when it's actively practiced and encouraged. Gender is another factor, though the reasons are complex. Studies have found that on average, women report earlier and more emotionally detailed childhood memories than men. Whether this is biological or a product of different socialization patterns around emotional expression and narrative, or some combination of both, is still debated. And then there's stress. Significant emotional experiences, particularly frightening ones, sometimes leave traces that other memories don't. The amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system, is active and functional much earlier in development than the hippocampus. Fear responses, intense emotional moments, can sometimes leave residues that surface later, as feelings or physical reactions without any accompanying narrative memory. You might become inexplicably anxious in a hospital, or feel an unaccountable sense of safety at the smell of a specific food without knowing why. The emotion remembered the experience, even when the story didn't. Here's something that doesn't get discussed nearly enough in all of this: sleep. Memory consolidation. The process by which new experiences are converted into stable long-term memories happens primarily during sleep. Specifically during slow-wave sleep and REM sleep, when the brain essentially replays and reorganizes the day's experiences, strengthening important connections and pruning unnecessary ones. Infants sleep enormously. A newborn sleeps 16 to 18 hours a day, and their sleep architecture is radically different from adult sleep. They spend far more of their sleep time in active REM-like states than adults do. For decades, researchers assumed this was just a biological quirk of development with no particular significance for memory. It turns out that might be wrong. Some researchers now believe that the enormous amounts of active sleep in infancy serve a specific developmental function, not storing discrete memories, but consolidating the foundational patterns that underlie learning. Learning how faces work, how voices work, how physical objects behave in space, how social interaction flows. The infant sleeping for 18 hours is not wasting time. The infant sleeping for 18 hours is building the operating system that everything else will run on, not saving individual files, installing the software. And one implication of this is that the experiences happening during those awake hours aren't being stored as memories precisely because they're being used for something more fundamental. They're being processed into architecture rather than narrative, into capability rather than story. You don't remember learning to see, but you can see. You don't remember learning that objects are solid and permanent, but you know it instantly and effortlessly every moment of your life. You don't remember learning to read faces and voices for emotional meaning, but you do it automatically, thousands of times a day, without any conscious effort. All of that was learned in the years you can't remember. It just got filed in a different format than the memories you can access. Deeper, more permanent, more fundamental. So what does all of this mean for you right now? It means that the first years of your life were not wasted just because you can't remember them. They were, in many ways, the most consequential years of your entire existence. The years when the foundational architecture of who you are was laid down at a level deeper than memory can reach. The person you are, the way you attach to people, the way you respond to uncertainty, the things that calm you, and the things that destabilize you, the intuitions you can't explain, and the fears that seem to come from nowhere. All of that has roots in a period of your life that is completely invisible to your conscious mind. You are built from experiences you cannot access. That's either terrifying or liberating, depending on how you hold it. On the terrifying side, you can't examine the foundations. You can't go back and audit the first 3 years to understand why you are the way you are. The influences are real. They're shaping you constantly, and they're entirely outside your conscious reach. On the liberating side, the absence of explicit memory means the absence of explicit narrative. You don't have a story you tell yourself about those years. And that means the story isn't fixed. The implicit patterns can be changed, not by remembering because there's nothing to remember, but by new experiences that update the old calibrations. Therapy, safe relationships, consistent new evidence that the world is different from what your 3-month-old self concluded it was. The brain is plastic. The early patterns are influential, but they're not destiny. They're just the starting position. And here's the last thing worth considering. Every generation is shaped by experiences they can't remember, passed down from caregivers who were shaped by experiences they couldn't remember either. The implicit emotional inheritance moves through families across generations. Anxiety patterns, attachment styles, default expectations about whether the world is safe, without anyone being able to point to the original source or consciously decide whether to pass it on. You received something from your caregivers that came from their caregivers, not as stories, not as explicit teaching, as calibration, as the emotional atmosphere you breathed in your earliest years before you had any awareness that you were absorbing it. The memories are gone, but what they built is sitting inside you right now, quietly running the show in ways you barely notice. The first years of your life happened. They mattered. More than almost any other years that followed, you just weren't allowed to keep the receipts. Basically having a full existential crisis because you exist. And you're just standing there, in your hiking boots, eating a granola bar. So what is actually going on here? Why do animals, creatures that have claws, venom, horns, speed, and sometimes the ability to literally detach their own tail, why are they terrified of us? Of soft, slow, mostly hairless apes who get winded climbing 2 flights of stairs? The answer goes way deeper than you think. And honestly, once you understand it, you'll never look at a spooked squirrel the same way again. Let's start from the very beginning. Here's something that should probably make you feel a little uncomfortable. The fear that animals have of humans didn't start last century. It didn't start when humans invented guns, or agriculture, or even fire. It started millions of years ago. Scientists have a term for it. The landscape of fear. It's the idea that prey animals don't just respond to predators when they're right in front of them. They shape their entire life around the possibility of a predator being nearby. Their feeding patterns, their sleeping spots, where they drink water, when they move, all of it is calibrated around avoiding death. And for a very, very long time, early humans were part of that calculation. Our ancestors hunted, a lot. Paleolithic humans were persistence hunters, meaning we didn't necessarily have the speed to outrun prey, but we had something arguably more terrifying. We just kept going, for hours, in the heat of the day, until the animal collapsed from exhaustion. If you were a gazelle and you saw a weird bipedal creature in the distance jogging at a medium pace, that was genuinely one of the most horrifying things you could witness. So animals learned, not individually, but generationally. The ones that didn't run from human-shaped silhouettes got eaten. The ones that did run survived, reproduced, and passed that wariness on to their offspring. Repeat that process over thousands of generations, and you get animals that are essentially pre-programmed with human fear baked into their DNA. It's not a learned behavior. It's a survival algorithm, the super predator theory. Now here's where things get genuinely fascinating, and a little bit flattering, honestly. In 2016, a team of researchers at the University of Western Ontario published a study that dropped a pretty wild claim. They argued that humans are, and I'm quoting here, the super predator, meaning we are feared by other predators more than they fear each other. They played audio recordings to animals, not of other predators, not of lions roaring or wolves howling, just the sound of humans talking, casual conversation, the kind of thing you'd hear at a bus stop. And the results were remarkable. Mountain lions fled at more than twice the rate they fled from other predators. Bobcats, deer, skunks, possums, they all bolted faster and harder from human voices than from any other threat. Some predators, animals that don't have natural enemies, still responded with the same panic response to human sounds. Think about that. A mountain lion, an apex predator, an animal that kills deer for breakfast, running away from the sound of someone chatting about their weekend plans. Why? Because even apex predators have a historical memory of humans being dangerous. We hunted them too. We pushed them out of habitats. We killed them when they got too close to livestock. Over time, even the top of the food chain learned humans equals threat. We're not just scary because we're predators. We're scary because we're unpredictable predators. And unpredictability in the animal kingdom is basically the most terrifying thing there is. The unpredictability problem. Let's talk about why unpredictability is such a big deal. Most predators follow patterns. A wolf hunts at dawn and dusk. A crocodile ambushes near water. A hawk hunts small rodents in open fields. Prey animals have evolved over millions of years to read these patterns, and knowing the pattern is what keeps them alive. A deer that knows where the wolves hunt can avoid that area. A fish that knows when the heron feeds can stay deeper during those hours. But humans? We hunt in the morning and at night. We hunt in groups and alone. We use fire, traps, spears, bows, rifles, drones. We hunt on land, in water, from helicopters. We hunt animals we eat and animals we don't eat. We hunt things that are dangerous and things that are completely harmless. From an animal's perspective, there is no pattern to us. We are a variable they cannot solve. And when you can't solve a variable, the only rational response is maximum avoidance at all times. There's actually a concept in behavioral ecology called predator recognition, and it describes how prey animals categorize threats. Most predators get slotted into recognizable categories. Big cat, bird of prey, canine. Animals have specific calibrated responses for each category, but humans don't fit neatly into any category. We smell weird, we move weirdly, we make strange noises, and then sometimes we feed birds in a park for 20 minutes. We break the algorithm. And that's deeply, deeply unsettling to an animal brain. But wait, what about animals that aren't scared of us? Good question, because you've definitely seen pigeons in a city square that would rather die than move out of your way. You've seen raccoons that look you dead in the eyes while eating your garbage. Seagulls that will steal a chip directly from your hand and maintain eye contact the entire time to assert dominance. So what's going on there? This is called habituation, and it's one of the most important concepts in animal behavior. When animals are repeatedly exposed to a stimulus, humans, in this case, without experiencing negative consequences, they gradually reduce their fear response. It's basically the brain saying, this thing keeps showing up and nothing bad happens. I'm wasting energy being scared of it, downgrading the threat level. Urban animals go through this process over generations. City pigeons have been living alongside humans for so long that the fear response has essentially been deselected. There's no survival advantage to running from people if people literally throw bread at you every day. Same with crows, which brings us to one of the most interesting examples. Crows not only habituate to humans, they actually recognize individual faces. Studies have shown that crows remember specific people who have wronged them and will harass those individuals for years. They'll recruit other crows to join in. They'll teach their young which humans are dangerous. So not only have crows lost their fear of humans, they've essentially developed a culture of human surveillance. They're filing mental notes on us, which is either really cool or genuinely terrifying depending on how much you've angered a crow recently. The island experiment that changed everything now. Here's one of the most mind-blowing pieces of evidence for why animals fear humans. And it comes from a natural experiment that took place in the oceans. On islands and in areas where humans have never been, or where humans have been absent for long periods, animals show almost no fear response at all. The Galapagos Islands are probably the most famous example. When Darwin arrived there in the 1830s, he was baffled. The animals just didn't move. He wrote in his journal about sitting next to birds that didn't fly away, pushing iguanas into the sea and watching them calmly swim back and sit next to him again. Marine iguanas, blue-footed boobies, giant tortoises, none of them ran. None of them cared. The same thing happens in parts of Antarctica. Penguins have essentially zero fear of humans. They'll walk straight up to researchers, inspect their equipment, occasionally try to steal things. Scientists doing field work have to fight off curious penguins who are fascinated by their cameras and backpacks. And in marine reserves where fishing has been banned for decades, fish populations start losing their fear of divers. Researchers have documented fish in protected zones that actively swim toward humans, while fish in adjacent unprotected zones flee. The conclusion is incredibly stark. The fear of humans is not a factory setting. It's installed through experience. When humans stop being a threat, either because they were never there, or because hunting stopped, the fear dissolves, sometimes within just a few generations, which means the fear isn't about us specifically. It's about what we do, the ecology of fear, and what it actually does to ecosystems. Here's where it gets really interesting, because this fear isn't just a quirky animal behavior. It reshapes entire ecosystems. Scientists studying wolves in Yellowstone National Park discovered something unexpected. When wolves were reintroduced to the park in 1995, the deer population didn't just decrease, it changed behavior. Deer stopped grazing in open valleys. They avoided riverbanks. They moved differently and spent less time in exposed areas. And because deer stopped overgrazing these areas, the vegetation came back. Rivers changed course because the bank erosion slowed down. Trees grew back. Bird species returned. Fish populations rebounded because the streams became healthier. All of this because the wolves made the deer afraid. The fear itself, not just the predation, was driving ecosystem change. This is what ecologists call a landscape of fear. And it's one of the most powerful invisible forces in nature. Now apply that to humans. When humans enter an area, as hunters or just as a consistent presence, the same fear effect kicks in. Animals move differently. They avoid certain areas during certain times. They change their feeding patterns. Nocturnal behavior increases because darkness provides cover. Animals that used to be active by day shift their schedules to minimize overlap with humans. A 2018 study published in Science found that animals across 6 continents had become significantly more nocturnal in response to human activity. Mammals that were previously active during the day were shifting to night, not because of habitat destruction, but simply because humans were around. The mere presence of humans was enough to rewire the daily schedule of wildlife across the planet. We're not just predators. We're a global ecological force that's literally changing when animals decide to be awake. The smell thing. Okay, let's talk about something nobody really wants to hear. Animals might also be scared of us because we smell absolutely horrific to them. Human scent is a genuinely potent chemical signal in the wild. We carry a cocktail of synthetic chemicals, deodorant, soap, laundry detergent, food, plastics, exhaust, various other things we don't want to think too hard about. That is completely alien to natural ecosystems. Even if you strip all of that away and just talk about natural human body odor, the signal is still powerful and distinctive. Predator urine is commonly used as a deterrent in wildlife management because animals read scent as a primary threat signal. Human scent has been shown to trigger similar responses. When researchers left scent strips soaked in human sweat near wildlife cameras, the reduction in animal activity was comparable to leaving strips soaked in mountain lion urine. Let that sink in. You, existing, giving off the odor of being alive, are roughly as scary to local wildlife as a mountain lion. Some of you are already aware of this and use it as a personality trait. That's fine. Why some animals attack instead of running now? Fair question. If animals are so scared of us, why do some of them attack? And the answer here is almost always the same. They're not attacking out of aggression. They're attacking out of desperation. The vast majority of dangerous animal encounters happen in one of three scenarios. First, the animal feels cornered and has no escape route. Second, the animal is a mother protecting offspring. Third, the animal has been pushed into close proximity with humans by habitat destruction and is operating under extreme stress. In almost every case, the attack is a last resort. It's not predatory, it's defensive. Bears are a good example. Bears are naturally extremely avoidant of humans. Given any reasonable opportunity, a bear will leave. The problem is that as human development expands into bear habitat, the margin for avoidance gets smaller. Bears are left with fewer options, less food, and more forced human contact. And when an already stressed animal with no escape route gets surprised at close range, it reacts the way any animal, including humans, would react. It goes on offense. There are genuine exceptions. Polar bears are one. They're one of the few large predators that will actively hunt humans. But this becomes less surprising when you consider that polar bears evolved in an environment with essentially no large predators except themselves, very few prey choices, and absolutely nothing that would have taught them to fear bipedal creatures. They simply never received the memo. What happens when animals have never seen humans before? The most striking evidence for all of this comes from first contact situations, moments when human explorers or researchers encounter animals that have had zero previous exposure to people. The results are consistently the same. No fear. None. Historical accounts from Pacific exploration describe sailors walking up to birds that had never seen humans before and picking them up. Early accounts of the dodo, famously extinct now, largely because of this, describe an animal so utterly fearless of humans that hunting them required almost no effort. They would walk toward the hunters. The sailors thought they were stupid. They weren't stupid. They just hadn't been taught to be afraid yet. The same pattern shows up in modern contexts. When researchers reach remote populations, certain isolated insect species, deep-sea creatures brought up for the first time, the fear response is absent or minimal. And this gives us a window into what the world looked like before we became such an overwhelming presence. Not a world without danger, but a world where the danger didn't walk upright and didn't come from everywhere at once. The evolutionary arms race. Here's the uncomfortable philosophical corner we end up in when you push this far enough. The fear that animals have of us isn't a mistake. It's accurate. It's a correct read of the situation. Humans have caused the extinction of hundreds of species. We've hunted populations to collapse. We've transformed or destroyed more than half of all natural habitat on Earth. We've altered the global climate. The animals that are scared of us are, statistically speaking, making the right call. But here's the twist. Because of that fear, because animals flee, avoid, and hide from us, we often don't see the full scale of the impact we're having. Wildlife becomes invisible. We go to nature and see less and less, and we interpret that as nature doing fine. The absence of animals reads as peacefulness rather than flight. The fear actually makes it easier for us to not notice what we're doing. And the cruelest part of the landscape of fear is this. It works against conservation too. Animals that are deeply afraid of humans are harder to study, harder to protect, harder to help. Fear is a wall that keeps researchers out and keeps animals from benefiting from human protection. The most traumatized wildlife populations are also the most unreachable ones. The thin thread of habituation, and why it matters. But let's end on something a little more hopeful, because this is genuinely one of the most interesting things happening in wildlife science right now. Researchers are increasingly finding that given the right conditions, consistent non-threatening human presence, food stability, reduced hunting pressure, animals can and do rehabituate to humans within surprisingly short time frames. Mountain gorilla tourism programs in Rwanda and Uganda have documented gorilla groups that went from fleeing rangers on site to tolerating, and in some cases seemingly enjoying, the proximity of human observers over the course of just a few years of careful, respectful habituation work. Not because the gorillas forgot to be scared, but because they were given enough data points to update their model. These specific humans. in this specific place. Consistent, non-threatening, no negative outcomes. The fear is learned, and learning can go both ways. Rewilded areas, places where human hunting and disturbance have been removed, show animals gradually recovering their natural activity patterns. Daytime grazing returns. Open area use returns. The tight, hypervigilant behavior of heavily hunted populations relaxes. The landscape of fear can be dismantled. It just requires humans to be reliably, consistently, provably not a threat. And given our track record, that's a project. Animals are scared of us because we spent millions of years earning that fear. We are the most versatile, persistent, unpredictable, and ecologically dominant predator this planet has ever produced. We hunt every continent, in every climate, at every hour. We don't fit any pattern that animal brains know how to process. We've driven species extinct on every landmass we've ever set foot on. We alter ecosystems by simply being present. The squirrel having a crisis on the lawn isn't being dramatic. It's running a survival program that's been refined across hundreds of thousands of years. It literally does not know that you're just trying to eat a granola bar and appreciate nature. But here's the thing. That same intelligence that made us so frightening, the creativity, the adaptability, the sheer capability, is also what allows us to choose differently. The animals that live in places where humans are reliably safe don't run. They don't hide. They live out in the open, in the daylight, going about their lives without dedicating enormous amounts of energy to constant vigilance. That version of the world exists. It exists in patches, in reserves, in islands where the experiment ran long enough. The landscape of fear is not permanent. It's a reflection of behavior, and behavior can change. The question is whether we're interesting enough to try. It's roughly 170,000 years ago. You're a human, barely recognizable as one, but still. You wake up, stretch, look around at the African savanna, and at absolutely no point do you think you know what would really complete this morning. Pants. And yet, here we are. Billions of people every single morning putting on pants, or skirts, or whatever you call that thing that's technically pajamas but you've been wearing for 3 days straight and you're calling it loungewear now because that sounds intentional. Clothes are so baked into human existence that we literally arrest people for not wearing them. Think about that for a second. The state will intervene if you're too naked. We built an entire legal system around the concept of please, put something on. We have laws about nudity as a species. That is where we are. But why? When did this start? And more importantly, why did we do it when basically every other animal on the planet just didn't? Dogs don't wear clothes. Wolves don't wear clothes. The elephant, which is objectively smarter than most people you went to high school with, has never once thought, I need a jacket for this. The short answer is, we have no idea exactly when it happened. The long answer is way more interesting and slightly weird, and it involves lice, which, spoiler, is not as gross as it sounds. Actually, it is. It's exactly as gross as it sounds. But stick with it, because the lice thing is genuinely one of the most bizarre and fascinating pieces of evolutionary detective work in all of science. Let's go back to the beginning. The naked ape problem. Here's something nobody talks about enough. Humans are basically the only large mammals on Earth that are nearly hairless. Genuinely stop and think about that zoologically for a second. Gorillas? Covered. Chimpanzees? Covered. Bears, lions, wolves, horses, elephants, hippos, all of them across wildly different environments and climates are walking around in full coats. And then there's us, standing in the middle of all this biodiversity, just smooth, a bit patchy, weirdly pink in some places, sporting an evolutionary look that says, I used to have fur, but I made some choices. Scientists have a few theories for why we lost our fur in the first place. The most popular one is the thermoregulation argument. Basically, as our ancestors moved from forests to open grasslands and started running long distances to hunt, being covered in thick fur became a massive liability. You'd overheat, you'd slow down, your core temperature would spike, and you'd collapse before catching the thing you were chasing, and then you'd die hungry, which from an evolutionary perspective is the worst possible outcome. So over hundreds of thousands of years, we gradually shed our fur and developed something better, an absolutely insane number of sweat glands. Humans have approximately 2 to 4 million sweat glands on their bodies. That is more than almost any other animal on the planet. We are, without exaggeration, elite sweating machines. Professional grade, world-class moisture emitters. If there were Olympics for sweating, we would dominate every category. This is great in the summer. It is considerably less great when it's 40 below zero and you're trying to survive in Central Asia with nothing but your wits and a rock. And that's where clothes come in, eventually. Warmth was probably not the first reason. Probably. Here's the conventional story. Humans moved out of Africa, hit colder climates, got cold, wrapped themselves in animal skins, and that's that. Simple, clean, logical. A 5-year-old could figure it out. Except the timeline doesn't quite work, and once you notice that, the whole tidy narrative starts to unravel. Genetic evidence, which we'll get to in about 30 seconds, suggests that humans started wearing clothes somewhere around 100,000 to 170,000 years ago. The problem is that modern humans didn't really start migrating out of Africa in significant numbers until around 70,000 years ago. So if clothes were purely a response to cold weather, why are they appearing tens of thousands of years before humans actually went anywhere cold? Something else must have been going on earlier. Something social. Something that has more to do with who we are as a species than with the temperature outside. But before we get into that, we need to talk about the most unlikely piece of evidence in the entire clothing origin story. And yes, it's the lice. We're doing the lice now. The louse that changed everything. Researchers at the University of Florida were doing what geneticists do, which apparently involves staring at very small things for extremely long periods of time and occasionally having a breakthrough that changes everything. And they decided to map the evolutionary history of human lice. Now, here's the crucial piece of biology you need to understand. Humans have two main types of lice: head lice and body lice. Head lice live in your hair. Body lice live specifically in clothing, in the seams, in the folds, in the fabric. They are two genetically distinct populations, and body lice evolved from head lice at some specific moment in history. Here's why that matters enormously. Body lice can only survive if there are clothes to live in. They cannot survive on bare human skin. They need fabric. They need the warmth and shelter that clothing provides. So the moment body lice genetically diverged from head lice, the moment that evolutionary split happened, is essentially the moment humans started wearing clothes consistently enough to create a new ecological niche for a parasite. When researchers ran the numbers, they found that body lice diverged from head lice somewhere between 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. Let that sit for a moment. A parasitic insect, one of the most universally hated creatures in human history, the thing that causes mass panic in elementary schools and ruins camping trips, accidentally preserved the earliest evidence of human fashion. The lice know when we got dressed before we do. They were there. They adapted, they moved in. That is either beautiful or deeply, deeply horrifying. Possibly both simultaneously, probably both. So, what were clothes actually for first? Okay, so we've established that clothing predates the migration out of Africa by a significant margin, which means warmth cannot be the original driver. So, what was? Theory number 1. Basic physical protection. Not from cold, but from sun, insects, sharp vegetation, and general abrasion. If you're spending your days walking through tall grass and thorny scrubland, tracking animals across rocky terrain, a basic wrap or loincloth made from animal hide creates a meaningful barrier between your skin and things that want to scratch, bite, or burn it. It's not glamorous, it's not philosophically interesting, but it probably kept early humans significantly more comfortable and reduced infections from small cuts and wounds. Sometimes the boring answer is the right one. Theory number 2 is where it gets genuinely interesting: social signaling. Humans are, at our core, profoundly social animals. We are obsessed with hierarchy in a way that goes bone deep. We are constantly, compulsively communicating who we are, what group we belong to, what status we hold, whether you should be scared of us, or attracted to us, or deferential to us. We do this with our posture, our facial expressions, our voices, our hairstyles, our tattoos. and quite possibly from very early on, with what we drape over our bodies. There's evidence that our ancestors were using pigments like ochre for body decoration as far back as 200,000 years ago. That's before the lice evidence for clothing, so the impulse to decorate the body to signal something visually about yourself to the group, that may actually be older than clothing itself. We were painting ourselves before we were dressing ourselves. The jump from decorating your skin to wearing a particular kind of hide in a particular way isn't a large cognitive leap, and once the hide is on, you start thinking about which hide, and how it's worn, and what that communicates. Is this the hide of something powerful? Did I kill it myself? Does wearing it say something about me? Welcome to the very first fashion industry. Population: a small band of Homo sapiens on the African savanna, arguing about who gets to wear the leopard skin. Needles, awls, and the invention of tailoring. For most of early human history, clothing probably looked rough. A skin draped over the shoulders, held in place with a cord made of twisted sinew, maybe crudely cut along the edges with a stone flake. Functional, ungainly. The prehistoric equivalent of wearing a bin bag. Gets the job done, but nobody's winning any awards. But then, around 50,000 years ago, something changes in the archaeological record. Researchers start finding bone needles, not just pointed tools for punching holes, actual needles with tiny eyes bored through them, clearly designed for threading sinew or fiber and stitching material together with precision. Fitted clothing, sewn seams, garments shaped to the body rather than just thrown over it. The oldest confirmed needle with a proper eye was found in Denisova Cave in Siberia, and dates back approximately 50,000 years. It was made from the hollow bone of a bird, shaped and polished to a fineness that is genuinely extraordinary. This object represents a cognitive leap that is difficult to overstate. Someone looked at a sliver of bone, envisioned a tool that didn't yet exist, figured out how to bore a clean hole through the narrow end without splitting it, and used the finished product to join two pieces of material with a controlled, repeatable stitch. That is not survival instinct. That is engineering. That is design thinking. That is someone solving a problem through imagination and craft rather than brute force. And that needle matters more than almost any other object from that period. Because you can live without pottery, you can live without cave paintings. In Siberia, 50,000 years ago, in the depths of a glacial winter, without properly fitted clothing that seals heat against the body, you absolutely cannot. The Neanderthals were doing it, too. Here's something that often gets dropped from the clothing origin story, mostly because it complicates the neat modern humans invented everything narrative. Neanderthals were also making and wearing clothes, and they were doing it well before they ever encountered us. We've found substantial evidence of Neanderthals systematically processing animal hides, scraping bones in patterns consistent with hide preparation, using specific stone tools that were clearly designed for working leather, and managing carcasses in ways that suggest they were after the skin as much as the meat. There's also genetic and anatomical evidence suggesting Neanderthals had physiological adaptations to cold climates, stockier bodies, shorter limbs, different fat distribution, which tells us they were dealing with serious cold for a very long time. Clothes would have been essential, not optional. And then there are the Denisovans, the mysterious third human lineage we only discovered in 2010 from a single finger bone found in that same Siberian cave. In the same archaeological layers as the needle, researchers found pierced and polished ornaments that suggest symbolic thinking, decoration, and possibly garment embellishment. A people we barely know existed were already thinking about what they were wearing and how it looked. So the impulse to clothe the body wasn't exclusive to our lineage. Multiple human species in different environments arrived at similar solutions through overlapping reasoning, which raises a genuinely unsettling question. Is clothing a human thing, or is it a smart bipedal primate living in a harsh environment thing? Is it inevitable? Would any sufficiently intelligent creature, cold enough and social enough, eventually figure out that wrapping yourself in something is just obviously correct? We don't know, but the convergence across species is very hard to dismiss. Let's take a step back and talk about the truly strange thing here. The thing that separates human clothing from every other animal's relationship with shelter or protection. If clothes were purely practical, every culture across history would converge on the most thermally efficient solution for their climate and just stay there forever. Thick hides in the Arctic, light plant fiber in the tropics, same shapes, same function, total standardization. Done. That is categorically not what happened. What happened is that humans immediately and universally made clothing mean something. In every culture we have records of, going back to the earliest archaeological evidence, clothing carries symbolic weight that goes far beyond its physical function. Priests wore different things than warriors. Rulers wore things nobody else was allowed to wear. The dead were buried in specific garments suited to their status and the journey ahead of them. Ceremonies required specific dress that would be absurd in any other context. Some of the oldest textile fragments ever found weren't just pieces of fabric. They were dyed in multiple colors. Someone, tens of thousands of years ago, looked at a perfectly functional piece of woven material and thought, this needs to be a different color. Not because it would keep them warmer, but because it would mean something different. Because it would say something. This is the fundamental weirdness of human clothing. We use it as language. We use it to construct and broadcast identity. We use it to say, I belong to this group, I hold this rank, I am mourning, I am celebrating, I am dangerous, I am available, I am sacred, I am ordinary. No other animal does this. Peacocks display, sure. Cuttlefish change color, but they're not choosing what to communicate based on social context, cultural history, and personal narrative. That's entirely ours. And it started, as best we can tell, in Africa between 1 and 200,000 years ago, when some ancestor of ours picked up a piece of ochre, painted themselves with it, and felt something click into place about who they were in relation to everyone else. Even if warmth wasn't the original reason, it became a survival-critical one fast. Between roughly 120,000 and 70,000 years ago, Earth went through a series of brutal glacial cycles. Global temperatures plunged, ice sheets expanded dramatically. Large portions of Africa became hyper-arid. Lakes dried up. Food sources collapsed. The human population may have crashed to somewhere between 10 and 30,000 individuals at its lowest point. We nearly went extinct. We came astonishingly close to just not existing anymore, as a species, before we'd even gotten properly started. For the survivors, and especially for the groups that eventually pushed north into Europe and east into Central Asia over the following millennia, clothing was no longer a social signal or a practical comfort. It was the thin line between life and death, quite literally. The groups that had already developed sophisticated clothing technology, fitted, layered, stitched, sealed at the extremities, had a survival advantage so significant it's hard to overstate. A properly constructed garment traps warm air against the body. It protects the wrists and neck, the places where blood runs close to the surface and heat escapes fastest. It allows a human body to survive temperatures that would kill an unclothed person in hours. Those with the needle, the thread, the knowledge of how to prepare hide and layer materials, they made it through. They had children. Those children learned the same skills, and those skills carried forward across generations are part of the reason modern humans made it to every continent on Earth. We didn't just evolve bodies suited for the world, we built a second skin and carried it everywhere we went. There's a transition in the clothing story that often gets glossed over, because it doesn't have a single dramatic moment attached to it. The shift from animal hides to woven plant fibers. Animal hides are warm, durable, and water-resistant. They're also heavy, stiff, difficult to clean, and you need to kill something to get them, which is a logistical constraint. At some point, humans started working with plant fibers, spinning them into thread, twisting them into cord, eventually weaving them into fabric. The oldest known twisted plant fiber was found in a cave in the Republic of Georgia, the country, not the state, and dates to roughly 30,000 years ago. Crucially, those fibers were dyed in multiple colors, already decorative, already intentional, already communicating something beyond simple function. By the time of the Neolithic agricultural revolution, roughly 10,000 BCE onwards, textile production had become a core technology of human civilization. Flax cultivation for linen, wool from domesticated sheep. Eventually, cotton, silk, and the extraordinary variety of fibers that different cultures developed independently across the world. And with textiles came something genuinely revolutionary: the wardrobe, clothing that could be specialized for different purposes. A heavy cloak for winter, a light wrap for summer, specific garments for ritual, for work, for status, for mourning. Clothing as a system of expression rather than a single object of survival. The textile industry, long before the Industrial Revolution made it mechanical, was one of the most significant economic and cultural forces in the ancient world. Entire trade routes were built on it. Empires were financed by it. Wars were fought over access to the raw materials for it. Silk alone reshaped the political geography of half the world. All of this from a cold, naked primate with clever hands and a piece of bone. So why did ancient humans start wearing clothes? The honest answer is, for all the reasons, in overlapping waves, driven by biology and culture and climate and social complexity all at once. It probably started with practical protection, something between the skin and the thorns and the sun and the biting things. It evolved almost immediately into social signaling, a way of saying something about who you are in a world full of other people making constant judgments about you. It became a survival technology when the climate turned hostile and the migrations began. And it became an art form, an industry, a language, and an identity as human culture grew more complex. The remarkable thing isn't that we started wearing clothes. Given who we are, social, symbolic, status-obsessed, freezing half the time, it was probably inevitable. You are doing that right now. Whatever you're wearing, you made choices, conscious and unconscious ones, about what to put on your body today. And those choices reflect something about who you are, how you feel, what group you belong to, what image of yourself you're presenting to the world. You are doing exactly what that person on the African savannah was doing, wrapped in ochre-stained hide, figuring out how to signal something about themselves to the people standing around the same fire. 150,000 years of human history, and what connects you to them, directly, without interruption, is the simple fact that you got dressed this morning. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing. We get cold, we get creative, we get dressed, and then we spend the rest of our lives complaining that we have nothing to wear. Some things, genuinely, never change. And what about you? Would you go back in time and live completely naked? Let me know in the comments. Until then, see you soon.